During the late corridor inspection, the Royal Guard noticed something that should not have been there. A small child's sleeve, folded neatly, left on a window ledge outside the private nursery entrance. No attendants were scheduled. The corridor log showed no entries for the past hour. He stopped, listening. From inside the closed chamber, a faint movement sounded. Then silence. The corridor outside the private nursery remained unusually still, the tall windows dim with late evening haze, and the air carrying the faint scent of polished wood and linen. The Royal Guard stood for a moment where he had first noticed the folded child's sleeve resting on the stone ledge, its small cuff slightly creased, as if removed in haste but placed with deliberate care. Nothing else in the corridor suggested disorder. The lamps burned steadily, the carpets lay undisturbed, and the duty log terminal at the end of the hall showed no entries for the past hour, an absence more striking than any error. He keyed in his clearance, confirmed his patrol position, and approached the nursery door. Protocol required that he announce entry, but he paused first, listening. From inside came only the faint shift of fabric, then silence again, a silence that felt occupied rather than empty. He opened the door slowly to avoid startling whoever might be inside. The nursery was lit by a single wall lamp, casting long, soft shadows across the floor. Toys remained arranged in careful order, a low table set with colored blocks, a book left open to an illustrated page. Near the window, seated in a small upholstered chair, the young royal sat motionless, feet not quite touching the floor, gaze fixed on nothing in particular. The child did not react immediately to the guard's presence, which in itself was unusual. Most children in the household looked up at the quiet sound of a uniform entering a room. He stepped forward, posture calm, voice low and neutral, as training required when addressing minors. He asked if everything was well. The child nodded after a delay that was just long enough to feel uncertain. The guard noticed the sleeves of the child's shirt were rolled unevenly, one higher than the other, and as the child shifted slightly in the chair, the lamplight fell across the forearm. The bruises were faint but unmistakable, parallel bruising, fresh enough to hold a dull bluish tone beneath the skin. He did not react outwardly. Training suppressed the instinctive response, replacing it with observation, size, placement, coloration, symmetry. These were not the scattered marks of play or accidental contact with furniture. They suggested grip, controlled pressure, and recent occurrence. He crouched slightly to bring himself level with the child's seated height, asking quietly whether there had been a fall or a game played roughly. The child shook their head, eyes dropping to the carpet, hands drawing inward toward the body in a guarded motion that the guard recognized from prior safeguarding briefings. A draft stirred the curtains behind them, and somewhere in the corridor a distant door closed, the sound echoing faintly through stone and plaster. The guard rose, scanning the room without appearing to do so, noting the untouched glass of water on the bedside table, the absence of any attendant, and the still warm indentation on a second chair near the wall, as if someone had left not long before. He felt the first quiet tightening of unease, the sense that the unrecorded hour in the log was no administrative oversight, but a deliberate gap. And he turned toward the internal communication panel, hesitating for a fraction of a second as he considered what the next step would set in motion. He did not call immediately. Instead, he completed the first requirement of protocol, verification of the child's immediate condition. He asked permission to examine the arm more closely, keeping his tone measured, movements slow and visible so as not to cause alarm. The child extended the arm without speaking. The bruises were clearer at closer range, faint impressions spaced in a way that suggested fingers rather than impact. The skin was unbroken, but the tenderness was evident in the slight flinch when he adjusted the sleeve. He recorded the observation mentally, every detail fixed with the precision demanded by his training. The nursery clock ticked softly above the mantel, marking seconds that seemed to stretch longer than usual. He rose and moved to the duty terminal inside the room, logging his presence and the time, deliberately creating the first official record after the unexplained gap. The act felt heavier than routine documentation. It was the moment the irregularity ceased to be private observation and became part of the palace record. When he asked the child who had been present earlier, the answer came only as a quiet, "I don't know," spoken without eye contact, voice subdued but controlled, as though repeating a phrase already used before. That detail unsettled him more than the bruises themselves. Children rarely answered uncertainty with such precision unless they had been instructed to do so. He scanned the room again, noticing a faint scuff on the inner edge of the door at adult knee height, recent enough that the varnish dust still clung in a thin, pale line. There were no signs of struggle, no overturned objects, nothing dramatic, only these small, precise irregularities that formed a pattern visible only when taken together. The guard activated the secure camera on his duty tablet, angling it discreetly to document the injuries as required under safeguarding guidelines, ensuring the images were clinical and respectful, focused solely on the marks and not the child's face. The quiet click of the shutter sounded louder than it should have in the stillness. When he finished, he encrypted the file and attached it to a preliminary incident entry, leaving the classification level pending until supervisory review. Outside the nursery windows, the light had faded into a deep blue, the first evening lamps in the courtyard flickering one by one. The palace, from a distance, would have appeared serene, orderly, untouched by conflict. Inside the nursery, however, the guard felt the weight of something concealed moving slowly to the surface. He closed the incident log and rested his hand briefly on the back of the chair where the child sat, not in comfort, but in silent assurance of presence, then stepped to the door and signaled discreetly for an attendant to report. As he waited, listening to the echo of approaching footsteps in the corridor, a single thought settled with quiet certainty in his mind. Whatever happened during that unrecorded hour was not an accident, and the moment this report left his control, resistance would begin. The attendant who arrived at the nursery door slowed slightly upon seeing the guard still inside, as if surprised that a routine evening rotation had not already concluded. She offered a formal greeting, her composure correct, but her eyes moved quickly to the child and then to the guard's tablet resting in his hand. The guard acknowledged her with a brief nod and asked in a neutral tone who had been assigned to the nursery during the previous hour. The attendant consulted her wrist log, hesitated, and replied that the schedule showed a caretaker rotation, but the specific name field was blank, an omission that caused a faint tightening around her mouth. The guard requested that the child be escorted to the adjoining reading room for a short period while he completed a procedural review of the nursery. The request was routine enough to avoid alarm, and the attendant complied, guiding the child gently from the room. When the door closed, the silence deepened, broken only by the low hum of the ventilation system. The guard moved methodically, documenting the scuff near the door, the indentation in the chair cushion, and the absence of any entry in the digital duty log. Each observation was recorded with precise timestamps and location codes, forming a chain of evidence that could not easily be dismissed as speculation. He then accessed the internal safeguarding protocol and initiated a preliminary incident report, attaching the encrypted images and environmental notes. The system prompted him to select an escalation level. For several seconds, his finger hovered over the options. Level 1 would keep the report within the immediate supervisory circle, often resolved quietly. Level 2 would notify internal security and child welfare oversight, creating a formal record beyond the nursery staff's authority to contain. He selected Level 2. The confirmation tone sounded soft but decisive. Once submitted, the report could not be withdrawn without authorization. He secured the tablet and stepped into the corridor, where the evening patrol shift was changing. Two fellow guards passed, exchanging routine acknowledgments, unaware that anything unusual had occurred. The palace functioned with the steady rhythm of long-established order, yet beneath that order he could feel a subtle resistance already forming, like pressure building behind a closed valve. Within 20 minutes, his communicator vibrated with a message requesting his presence in the internal security office. The wording was polite, almost casual, but the timing confirmed that the report had reached the review desk faster than usual. As he walked through the corridors toward the administrative wing, the temperature seemed cooler, the stone floors carrying the faint echo of his measured steps. He reviewed the sequence of events in his mind, ensuring that every observation remained clear, every detail precise. He knew that accuracy would be questioned, not because it was flawed, but because of what it implied. The internal security office was lit by overhead panels that cast an even clinical light across the desks and wall monitors. A senior administrative officer sat at the central table, accompanied by two members of household management rather than the usual security supervisors. Their presence signaled that the matter had already shifted from routine safeguarding into the realm of household authority. The officer greeted him formally and asked him to recount his observations. The guard did so without embellishment, presenting the sequence of events, the physical evidence, and the absence of recorded supervision during the unaccounted hour. One of the household managers listened with folded hands, expression composed but distant, then asked whether the injuries might have resulted from ordinary childish behavior, suggesting that children often bruised easily. The guard replied that the pattern and placement were inconsistent with accidental impact, and that safeguarding protocol required documentation regardless of presumed cause. The response was calm, delivered without challenge, yet it altered the atmosphere in the room. The second manager leaned forward slightly and spoke in a quieter tone, emphasizing that matters involving young members of the royal household were sensitive and that unnecessary escalation could cause distress to the family. The implication was clear, though never stated directly. Discretion was expected, and the report could still be reclassified. The guard listened without interrupting, then answered that the report had already been filed under Level 2 and that reclassification would require a written justification under the Code of Protection. For a moment, no one spoke. The faint ticking of a wall clock became audible, marking the silence. The administrative officer finally nodded, acknowledging that procedure had been followed correctly, but his expression carried a trace of reluctance, as though recognizing that the process now lay beyond informal control. After the meeting concluded, the guard stepped back into the corridor, aware that several staff members glanced at him with brief, unreadable expressions before looking away. Word traveled quickly in enclosed institutions, and even the suggestion of an inquiry created unease. Later that evening, as he completed his patrol near the residential wing, a senior attendant approached him privately, speaking in a measured, almost sympathetic voice, suggesting that misunderstandings sometimes occurred, and that it might be wise to allow the household to resolve such matters internally. The guard listened, then simply replied that safeguarding procedures existed precisely for situations that could not be resolved informally. The attendant's polite smile faded slightly before she excused herself and walked away. The corridor fell quiet again, lit only by the soft glow of wall lamps. Standing there, the guard felt the weight of the decision he had made earlier in the nursery, understanding now that the resistance would not come openly or all at once, but in careful words, delayed responses, and subtle attempts to redirect responsibility. And somewhere beyond those quiet pressures, he sensed that the report had already reached higher levels of authority, where the consequences would no longer be subtle at all.
The summons arrived the following morning, delivered through the formal channel rather than the internal security network, which in itself carried significance. The message was brief, instructing the guard to report to a private audience chamber in the residential wing at precisely 10 o'clock. No subject was listed, but none was necessary. By the time he finished his early patrol, word of the safeguarding report had already spread quietly through the palace staff, carried in fragments of conversation that stopped when he approached. The corridors that morning felt unusually subdued, as if the building itself were holding its breath. When he reached the audience chamber, 2 footmen stood outside the carved doors, their expressions neutral but attentive. One opened the door without announcement, and the guard stepped inside. The chamber was large but dim, lit by tall windows veiled with thin curtains that softened the winter light. Prince Edward stood near a long table, one hand resting on its polished surface, posture rigid in a way that suggested contained movement rather than stillness. A private secretary stood several steps behind him, silent, observing. The guard halted at the prescribed distance and gave the formal salute. For several seconds, no one spoke. The silence carried a weight that felt deliberate, as though the prince were measuring the space before speaking. When he did, his voice was controlled but edged with restrained anger. He asked whether it was true that the guard had filed a safeguarding report concerning a young member of the household and had included photographic evidence without prior consultation. The guard confirmed that he had, stating only that he had followed the required protocol. The prince's hand tightened slightly on the table, the faint sound of knuckles pressing against wood audible in the quiet room. He began to pace slowly, the movement measured but restless, and spoke of reputation, of the fragility of public trust, of the damage that could be done by internal accusations mishandled or exaggerated. None of his words were shouted, yet the force behind them was unmistakable. The guard listened without shifting his posture, aware that the entire exchange was being witnessed by the secretary and, beyond the closed doors, by a system of institutional memory that would record not only decisions but conduct. He replied that loyalty to the household included loyalty to its youngest and most vulnerable members, and that the code of protection defined that responsibility in clear terms. He did not raise his voice, did not argue, and did not attempt to persuade. He simply stated the principle and allowed the silence afterward to carry its weight. The prince turned away abruptly, walking to the window, his reflection faint in the glass. For several seconds, only the distant sound of courtyard activity filtered into the chamber, the muted roll of a service cart, the faint call of a guard changing post. When the prince spoke again, his voice had cooled, the anger compressed into a formal tone that was more unsettling than the outburst. He said that the investigation would proceed, since the report now made that unavoidable, but that the guard should understand that trust within a royal household was not easily repaired once strained. The implication lingered in the air. The guard's future within the inner security rotation was now uncertain. The secretary made a brief notation, the scratch of pen on paper sounding unusually loud in the quiet room. The prince dismissed him with a curt nod. The guard saluted and turned and walked out, aware of the controlled rhythm of his own footsteps against the stone floor, each step measured to prevent any outward sign of tension. Outside, the corridor seemed brighter than before, the ordinary sounds of the palace resuming around him, yet the atmosphere had changed.
The confrontation had shifted the matter from quiet administrative concern into open conflict between duty and authority. As he resumed his patrol, he understood that the pressure would not lessen, it would intensify, not through open hostility, but through scrutiny, reassignment, and the subtle isolation that institutions used to test those who disrupted their balance. And somewhere within the palace, the investigation he had set in motion was already beginning to uncover what had been hidden during that unrecorded hour.
The investigation began without announcement. There were no formal notices posted, no visible teams moving through the residential corridors, and no disruption to the daily rhythm of the palace. Yet the guard began to notice small, deliberate changes. 2 unfamiliar officers from the Independent Protection Unit appeared at different posts, reviewing access terminals with quiet efficiency. Surveillance archives were requested under sealed authorization, and certain internal doors that were normally left on free rotation began requiring secondary clearance. The process unfolded with the careful precision of an operation designed not to attract attention. The guard was called to a secure office 3 days after the confrontation, not for questioning, but to verify timelines. A senior investigator, calm and methodical, asked him to reconstruct the sequence of events from the moment he first noticed the sleeve on the corridor ledge. The guard described everything in order, from the absence of log entries to the position of the chair and the timing of the attendant's arrival. The investigator did not interrupt, only making occasional notes, occasionally asking for clarification on distances or lighting conditions. It was clear that the inquiry depended on small details rather than dramatic revelations. When the interview concluded, the investigator thanked him and said only that the review would continue. The guard returned to duty with the sense that the matter had moved beyond personal confrontation into the slower, heavier machinery of institutional scrutiny. Over the next several days, he observed staff movements with increased awareness. A senior caretaker who had often supervised the nursery appeared less frequently, her duties reassigned without explanation. Records from the service corridors were quietly audited, and maintenance logs were cross-checked against security timestamps. The guard began to understand how concealment within such a structured environment required not bold deception, but subtle adjustments. A delayed entry here, a corrected timestamp there, a routine task performed slightly out of sequence. Each alteration alone was insignificant, but together they created a narrow window in which an incident could occur without record. One evening, while reviewing his patrol route, the guard was asked to accompany an investigator to a secondary monitoring room, rarely used except during large events. Inside, multiple screens displayed synchronized footage from the residential wing, each clip time-coded and aligned with access logs. The investigator pointed to a segment recorded during the unaccounted hour. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. Attendants moving along corridors, a caretaker entering the nursery wing, another leaving minutes later. But when the timestamps were compared with the official duty roster, a discrepancy appeared. The caretaker recorded as leaving had never logged entry, and the digital record of the door access had been overwritten less than an hour after the event. The alteration was subtle but detectable, a faint irregularity in the system's audit trail. The guard felt a quiet tightening in his chest as the realization formed. The missing hour had not been an oversight, it had been constructed. The investigation progressed carefully, each discovery verified through multiple sources before any conclusion was drawn. Interviews were conducted with staff under the pretext of routine administrative review, allowing the investigators to observe reactions without alerting those involved. The guard was not present for these conversations, but he could sense their effect. Conversations in the staff dining hall became shorter, more cautious. Certain attendants avoided eye contact when he passed, while others regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and unease, as though he had become a visible reminder of a boundary that few wished to acknowledge. Several days later, he was called again to the secure office.
This time, the investigator showed him a set of compiled findings, synchronized surveillance stills, corrected timelines, and a pattern of unauthorized disciplinary practices carried out by a senior caretaker over several months. The actions had been concealed through minor alterations to schedules and by exploiting periods when supervision was minimal. The injuries documented in the nursery were not an isolated event, but part of a pattern that had remained just below the threshold of formal reporting. The guard studied the images in silence, noting how ordinary the scenes appeared without context: an adult guiding a child by the arm, a door closing, a corridor empty a moment later. Only when placed in sequence did the meaning emerge. The investigator explained that the caretaker would be removed quietly to prevent disruption while the final review was completed. The emphasis, he said, was not on punishment alone, but on understanding how the safeguards had failed to detect the pattern earlier. When the meeting ended, the guard stepped outside into the evening air of the inner courtyard. The temperature had dropped, and the stone beneath his boots held the cold of approaching night. Lights glowed in the nursery windows above, steady and warm, and he allowed himself a brief moment of stillness, knowing that the child inside was now under direct supervision, the quiet threat removed. Yet the sense of resolution was incomplete. The confrontation with Prince Edward was unresolved, and the knowledge of what had been uncovered would soon reach him in full detail. The guard understood that the final phase of this matter would not be the investigation itself, but the decision of how the household would respond to what the investigation had revealed. The caretaker's removal occurred before dawn, carried out with the quiet efficiency reserved for matters the palace preferred not to discuss openly. By the time the morning staff reported for duty, her quarters were sealed, and her name had been removed from the active roster, replaced with a temporary assignment code. There was no announcement, only a brief internal memorandum stating that supervisory restructuring was underway in the residential wing. The guard read the notice in the security office, noting the deliberate neutrality of its language, the way it avoided describing what had actually happened. Institutions, he reflected, often preserved stability by softening the edges of truth. Yet the changes that followed were more tangible. New safeguarding procedures were issued within days, requiring dual attendant presence during all private nursery hours, automatic logging of corridor access, and mandatory medical review for any unexplained injury, no matter how minor. Training sessions were scheduled for household staff, conducted by the Independent Protection Unit, emphasizing observation, reporting, and the responsibility to question irregularities. The guard attended one of these briefings from the back of the room, listening as procedures he had long followed in principle were now being formalized in writing. He observed the reactions of the staff, some attentive, some uneasy, a few quietly resentful at the implication that the old system had been insufficient. The young royal returned to a regular routine under the new safeguards. The guard saw the child occasionally during his patrols, usually in the presence of 2 attendants and a tutor. The earlier withdrawn stillness gradually gave way to ordinary curiosity. The bruises had faded, leaving no visible trace, yet the guard knew that recovery was measured not in skin, but in confidence. One afternoon, as he passed the reading room, he noticed the child seated near the window, turning the pages of an illustrated book with slow concentration. The movement was unhurried, natural, and for the first time since that evening in the nursery, the guard sensed that the tension which had settled over that corridor was beginning to lift. Still, the atmosphere within the household remained altered in subtler ways. Conversations paused more often when he approached, not with hostility, but with a cautious respect that carried an undercurrent of distance. He had become associated with a disruption of the old order, and such associations rarely faded quickly. Several of his patrol assignments were shifted to outer corridors and administrative posts, a change explained as routine rotation, but understood by him as a quiet adjustment to limit his presence in the inner residential wing. He accepted the reassignment without comment. Duty, he had learned, was not always accompanied by approval. One evening, as he completed a late inspection of the West Passage, a sealed envelope awaited him in the security office, bearing the insignia of the palace command. Inside was a formal notice stating that his actions during the incident had been reviewed and found fully consistent with the Code of Protection. The wording was concise, almost austere, yet its meaning was unmistakable. His decision had been correct. He folded the notice carefully and placed it inside his log case, feeling not satisfaction but a quiet steadiness, the sense that a line had been drawn and held. Several days later, he was summoned once more to the residential wing, this time not to a private chamber, but to a smaller administrative office overlooking the inner gardens. Prince Edward was present, seated at a narrow desk, reviewing a document as the guard entered. The atmosphere was markedly different from their previous meeting. The prince's expression was composed, the anger that had once sharpened his voice now replaced by a controlled reserve. He dismissed the secretary with a brief gesture, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet room. For a moment, neither spoke. The muted sound of wind moving through the garden trees reached them through the partially opened window, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The guard set the document aside and said in an even tone that the investigation had concluded and that its findings had been clear. He did not apologize, nor did he attempt to justify his earlier reaction. Instead, he acknowledged that the guard had acted within his duty and that the household would implement the recommended safeguards in full. The wording was concise, almost austere, yet its meaning was unmistakable. His decision had been correct. He folded the notice carefully and placed it inside his log case, feeling not satisfaction but a quiet steadiness, the sense that a line had been drawn and held. Several days later, he was summoned once more to the residential wing, this time not to a private chamber, but to a smaller administrative office overlooking the inner gardens. Prince Edward was present, seated at a narrow desk, reviewing a document as the guard entered. The atmosphere was markedly different from their previous meeting. The prince's expression was composed, the anger that had once sharpened his voice now replaced by a controlled reserve. He dismissed the secretary with a brief gesture, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet room. For a moment, neither spoke. The muted sound of wind moving through the garden trees reached them through the partially opened window, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The guard set the document aside and said in an even tone that the investigation had concluded and that its findings had been clear. He did not apologize, nor did he attempt to justify his earlier reaction. Instead, he acknowledged that the guard had acted within his duty and that the household would implement the recommended safeguards in full. The wording was concise, almost austere, yet its meaning was unmistakable. His decision had been correct. He folded the notice carefully and placed it inside his log case, feeling not satisfaction but a quiet steadiness, the sense that a line had been drawn and held. Several days later, he was summoned once more to the residential wing, this time not to a private chamber, but to a smaller administrative office overlooking the inner gardens. Prince Edward was present, seated at a narrow desk, reviewing a document as the guard entered. The atmosphere was markedly different from their previous meeting. The prince's expression was composed, the anger that had once sharpened his voice now replaced by a controlled reserve. He dismissed the secretary with a brief gesture, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet room. For a moment, neither spoke. The muted sound of wind moving through the garden trees reached them through the partially opened window, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The guard set the document aside and said in an even tone that the investigation had concluded and that its findings had been clear. He did not apologize, nor did he attempt to justify his earlier reaction. Instead, he acknowledged that the guard had acted within his duty and that the household would implement the recommended safeguards in full. The wording was concise, almost austere, yet its meaning was unmistakable. His decision had been correct. He folded the notice carefully and placed it inside his log case, feeling not satisfaction, but a quiet steadiness, the sense that a line had been drawn and held. Several days later, he was summoned once more to the residential wing, this time not to a private chamber, but to a smaller administrative office overlooking the inner gardens. Prince Edward was present, seated at a narrow desk, reviewing a document as the guard entered. The atmosphere was markedly different from their previous meeting. The prince's expression was composed, the anger that had once sharpened his voice now replaced by a controlled reserve. He dismissed the secretary with a brief gesture, leaving the two of them alone in the quiet room. For a moment, neither spoke. The muted sound of wind moving through the garden trees reached them through the partially opened window, carrying the faint rustle of leaves. The guard set the document aside and said in an even tone that the investigation had concluded and that its findings had been clear. He did not apologize, nor did he attempt to justify his earlier reaction. Instead, he acknowledged that the guard had acted within his duty and that the household would implement the recommended safeguards in full. The wording was concise, almost austere, yet its meaning was unmistakable. His decision had been correct. He folded the notice carefully and placed it inside his log case, feeling not satisfaction, but a quiet steadiness, the sense that a line had been drawn and held. Several days later, he was summoned once more to the residential wing, this time not to a private chamber, but to a smaller administrative office overlooking the inner gardens. Prince Edward was present, seated at a narrow desk, reviewing a document as the guard entered. The atmosphere was markedly different from their previous meeting. The prince's expression